Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on where you are in Canada or the US, of course. My name is Rick Sterling, and I'm with Western Information Management. Most of you would know us as Western IM. I looked at the registrations page this morning just to see who had signed on, and I was very happy to see a bunch of friends there that have been friends of mine for almost 20 years. You know, all who know who you are. Presentation today, pleased to make this presentation of quick start for your team, projects that really make a difference. And I want to start by just thanking ARMA Canada for being proactive during this time of COVID and working from home to do their Connect series at all. And so happy that they allowed us to be part of that series. A little plug for ARMA, ARMA Canada and ARMA in general is I joined ARMA 25 years ago myself. And at that time, I was an IT guy. Our company was going to be selling records management software, and I really didn't know anything about records management at all. And fortunately for me, all my friends and colleagues at ARMA taught me what I needed to know. And that's where I got all my education at the start. I thought it was going to be easy when I came in, only to find out it was probably the hardest discipline I'd ever dealt with in my life. If you're not a professional member of ARMA, please join. Get involved. Reach out to your chapter, local chapter. Join a committee. Even look to joining the board at some point and getting really involved with ARMA. It's really important now, more so than any time at all, to stay connected with your information management community. And ARMA is one of those places where everybody tries to help everyone else. So please, please stay connected to your community and stay connected to ARMA. I must say the registration list this morning, the registration list sure lifted my spirits this morning when I saw the names. Thank you all for joining. So ARMA members are always willing to help. If you don't know Western IM, that's the company that I'm with, then we work right across Canada, have for a couple of decades now, all things records and information management. And we build an inventory tool, or information management inventory tool called Whisper. That's WISPIR. So just some housekeeping things. We decided to pre-record the first 30 minutes of the presentation today because Rick has a tendency to ramble. Many of you would know that because you know me. And so we pre-recorded that first 30 minutes just to keep it on track. After that, we're going to do a live session of the webinar. And the two people that are going to join me in that live session are Ken Oldenburger. Ken is the principal of Oldenburger Consulting in Victoria, and many of you know Ken because he's on the Canadian ARMA region team as well. And my partner, Troy Sawyer, it will be on that panel as well. Troy's got a decade of experience in records and information management, and he's also our lead developer and very involved in the technical side of projects involving metadata and things like that. So it ties right in with today's presentation and projects that we're going to talk about. And if you have to drop off, we may go over an hour with the panel side. So if you do have to drop off at all, don't worry about it. We will send out a link to the webinar, the recorded part of the webinar, to all of you after the webinar is finished. We get that ready. And there you'll also be able to get the slide deck and a lot of other useful information, hopefully, as well. So Troy, I'll let Troy start up the first 30 minutes now, and as soon as we get finished with that, we'll be back on live again. Today in the presentation, we start by going back to look at the start of the year, the very beginning. And then we're going to talk about what's happening now, and also look forward to the future as well. Then we're going to talk about a couple of project ideas that I think might focus your team on getting back in the swing of things really quickly. And when we go live again, it will be in the panel format. Where were we in early 2020? If you're anything like me, you had a good idea where the year was going to go. And you probably had some projects all lined up to do when we went forward in the year. You also had a pretty good idea where your corporation was going to go and how that was all going to fit together with your project choices. But unfortunately, that didn't quite work out the way we had all anticipated it. So what about April? I think there was a whole lot of confusion. I know in my case that was true. At the very end of March, my wife and I were away, and there was even more confusion because we had to try and get home. I am sure a lot of you might have been in that very same situation as well. And then, of course, corporations started letting people work from home, and IT was trying to actually get all the remote workers up and running and functional. And that was pretty difficult for a whole lot of people because many had never had an office at home before. They'd always worked in a bricks and mortar environment. They did not have the kind of computer equipment that would allow them sustained operation. And maybe they lived in a small apartment and had partners that also needed to work at home. And how about the kids at home as well? And of course, all that created its own set of issues. Then there were a lot of security concerns as well that IT and corporate security had to deal with in order to allow people working at home to be safer. It was a much different environment than being in a corporate infrastructure. Many family anxieties added to the mix as well, or maybe some aging parents lived with you, and of course some kids were at home, not at school, and maybe some other health issues existed in the family. Or a myriad of other things, like worry about being out and about, and how do we get groceries? Of course, the projects that we were working on were totally stalled. And that was the case for virtually all the people I talked to across the country. Nothing was going on because everybody was working from home and nobody was really sure how to proceed. So where are we now? So many that I talk to certainly aren't sure yet where they're at. A lot of disparate environments, certainly still. Some people working from the office part-time, many still working from home, and different disciplines in the organization are all kind of working sporadically on their own kind of processes and projects, but there's no real communication amongst the disciplines. A lot of it's reactionary and not really very proactive in this case. And IM policies, I don't know whether you've all gone back and re-looked at your policies from some of them from decades ago. They really don't mesh well with our kind of disparate, outbound, kind of all over the place work groups that we have now. And my question to everybody is, where is the information that everybody has created while they were working from home or out on their own? And many with their own printers. So there's paper information, there's potentially a lot of electronic information, and not everybody's sure exactly where it all went. And not all the users in every corporation are very careful with where that information goes. So just yet another factor to deal with. So where are we going in 2020, the rest of 2020 and on into 2021? Well, I don't think anybody's really sure yet. Is COVID really finished with us at all? Like, we still see now some bounces that are happening in certain areas in the country for ongoing COVID issues. We still don't have a vaccine, so a lot of people are going to continue to work from home. Working from home, in my opinion, will likely be a permanent option now for many in the future. So I don't think we'll ever go back to everybody driving into the office every day as we were in the past. IM policies absolutely need to be looked at and probably aligned with this new form of work that we're all kind of living with now. And we need to have a list of projects that we can accomplish in a hybrid environment. Not everything can be done in the same way as it used to when we were all in one place in a bricks and mortar environment. We need to be able to do our work in a virtual manner as required, because I think we're going to be in that model for quite some time to come. If you don't know what you have, you can't manage it. This statement relates directly to the two projects that I suggest to you today. If your area of expertise is risk,
or privacy, maybe security, or you are dedicated to records and information management, this same statement applies. Hold that thought as we go forward. If you don't know what you have, you can't manage it. Now something that pretty much all of us know, and that's that a project has the capability to redirect resources. It puts you in a positive direction, and this will refocus your team and other needed resources in your corporation in a very consistent way. It should also create positive wins, and boy do we need them at times like this. So you may have some projects already in mind for what you want to do to refocus your team. These are a couple that I'm going to suggest. And the first one, number one, is a physical records inventory / validation project. And you're going to go, really? Like paper now? Why would we want to do that? Well, we're going to talk about that. Let me first ask some questions. How long has your organization actually been doing physical records management? Well, for a lot of you, could have been decades. And you may or may not have been there when all of that got started. But there's a lot of information in paper in most of the organizations that I talk to across the country. And not everybody is really certain how accurate that information really is. Of course, the metadata describing those paper files and boxes lives in a whole lot of different formats, probably several different spreadsheets, a couple of different database forms, or there are probably pockets of information in filing cabinets, closets, under stairs, and lots of other places still that we just don't have information about. We all know that over time, things like summer students inputting information, or just changes in our own classification systems and retention schedules, as well as a whole lot of other reasons, could have made the information not quite as perfect as we might like. How much information in paper is still coming in? I would say probably less and less all the time if you're anything like everyone else I know. And a lot of the processes in the organizations have been turned into electronic form. And so paper is coming in at a much lower rate than it used to in the past. How much is it costing to store all that paper now? If you have your own storage locations, that's maybe a little bit easier situation for you. But in many instances, I know that corporate and government record centers across the country are way too small, and that requirements have outgrown the record centers altogether. If you use a third-party record center, there's a definite cost involved, particularly now when staff are working from home. How much does it cost to actually do a pull of information and send it off to a home address? It's time to actually start to get rid of some of that information if we can. Why now? Well, we know that we have to do something, and we probably should do something to refocus our teams. So let's look at why now. A paper records project is a good project for right now because there's a definite ROI if we can actually get rid of some boxes of paper. All you have to do is multiply your cost for storage and management of a box of paper to see what it is costing now, and this number then becomes a good way to get your project approved through senior management. Whether you have your own record center or whether it's in an off-site storage location, such as Iron Mountain or Access, it is costing you money to keep all of the paper. Most of us, I think, at one time or another have thought that a paper project would be a really good thing to do, but never got around to it. Now may be the perfect time. Now that COVID is here and has our teams working in a hybrid form, likely for some time to come, there will be many other reasons why we may not get back to normal for quite some time. No matter what, safety is the prime directive for our team. And paper information management may be the best thing to do. Paper is usually in locations where there are not a lot of people. So those locations may be perfect places to do the project today. You may come up with a whole lot of other reasons of your own for a paper project. But at this very moment, senior management may in fact be looking at the idea of downsizing some of the bricks and mortar locations in the company based on the fact that people will probably be working from home for quite some time to come. Less space required. Getting rid of paper may assist in this desire to downsize the organization. Some of the key individuals as well that may be able to help you in the company, and I don't mean your team, but others that may have extensive subject matter expertise, are probably at that age where they could actually retire at this point. As well, COVID, I think, will tip the scales for many who are very close to retirement, or even past that. And we don't really want to lose that subject matter expertise if we're thinking of doing physical records management projects sooner rather than later. The reasons keep adding up why this is a good time for this project. COVID has slowed down paper ingestion in your organizations. Because the people are working from home, and although they have printers, they're not necessarily creating stacks of corporate records in paper form. Just another great reason to get that paper cleaned up and organized once and for all. A physical inventory project at this time would be a lot more doable than a whole lot of other projects your team might tackle. Certainly, you don't have to talk to as many external forces in the organization in a physical inventory project as you may in other types that you might attempt. Other than a few subject matter experts that you may need to talk to, your team can likely accomplish this without external corporate resources. So what would a project like this actually look like? And what might the scope be? Well, I could easily believe that a project scope could be a particular business unit, or it might be a specific basement space loaded with information that you had never inventoried yet. I am sure that you have wanted to do some of these things for quite some time, and you probably have several ideas in mind as to what the scope might look like in a project like this. You will want to get your business case written up and focus on getting the maximum out of this project. You will start to make sure you have a classification system in hand, and even if it's a little outdated, shouldn't be a problem. You will want to check on what metadata you currently have and see what format it lives in, what various spreadsheet formats or database formats it may be in, and try and gauge how accurate you think that information might be. Now, who should you talk to internally about other things to consider while doing the project? Certainly, scanning comes up a lot these days. Should we actually scan some paper and leave the rest in paper form? Some organizations suggest scanning all the paper, which I, for one, do not recommend at all. You will certainly find some paper information during the project that is of high value and also potentially high access that would be better off scanned, thus giving your organization a backup of that physical information that doesn't exist currently. It would then be available, depending on its security, for other folks in your organization to see as well. How about other people to talk to in your organization about your project and what you might be able to do with them as well? So just who should we talk to? Other than the senior management, of course, since they would approve the funding of this project. Let's explore that a little more now. Let's start with privacy. And bear with me on this slide. I know it rambles a bit, but I promise there's a point in the end. I know this is Canada, and we don't care as much about the US, but it's kind of important and interesting to see what's been going on in the US based on privacy. They do not have a national privacy legislation, and many states have been passing their own privacy legislation. In 2000, a safe harbor agreement was crafted so that American corporations could transfer data to the EU, that's the European Union, and back again. That lasted until 2015, and then it became what was called the Privacy Shield Agreement. So that has now been dismissed by a European Union court. Here's what happened. I am sure that most of you would have heard about EU and GDPR. That's the General Data Protection Regulation that has come into the European Union. That was in 2018. A gentleman by the name of Max Schrems, who is an Austrian lawyer, didn't like Facebook very much because they had transferred his account to the US from Ireland in 2013. He sued on privacy grounds, and an EU court has now dismissed the Privacy Shield Agreement in total. This is a big deal, privacy-wise. I believe that the US will need to do something with a national privacy legislation sometime soon. Of course, once the US election is over. So here in Canada, we've had our Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, PIPEDA, since 2004. And we always like to have EU-like legislation here in Canada. But PIPEDA is very old right now and desperately needs an update. Quebec is currently talking about GDPR-like legislation on their own. And because Canada generally likes to have EU-friendly legislation, what do we all think is going to happen? We all pretty much know that PIPEDA will be updated, and I'm going to stick my neck out and say it will be GDPR-like when it happens. We need to know if there is PII, personally identifiable information, in our physical records. And the only way to find that is during a project. Privacy will continue to get more complex moving forward. You might follow that by talking to the risk people in your organization. That's assuming you have risk people there. You can't mitigate risk when you don't know what you have, is what the risk people would probably say. How about information that might be in a third-party contractor's hands? Personal information and privacy risk is always important to the organization, so we should absolutely talk to the risk people and see what we can do for them during this project. Security people in your organization cannot secure things properly when they don't know about them. In these days, most security people are not really sure they can secure everything in the organization. But if they don't know what the most critical information is, they can't lock it down. If you don't know what you have, you can't protect it. Remember, we are talking about paper records in this case, but the security folks also have to deal with physical security as well as electronic. I bet we can help there by informing them if we see issues during our project. It is also likely that the corporate security model has changed over time. Security might want us to flag physical information with a new security model on the way through the project. Security might be really helpful to you in getting this project approved. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this slide. I just put up some of the jobs that a general counsel might be doing in an organization, should you have a general counsel. Many of you may not, but almost all those jobs would be better served if there was a proper validated inventory of physical information in your organization going forward. Legal, of course, should be a really big supporter of this project in your organization. So back to the meat of the project. You do need to have teams or a team that will be out actually doing physical inventory or validation of what you currently have now. Optimum 2 to 3 people. Somebody with great keyboard skills is a real advantage, who can type in metadata as required if you find things that aren't inventoried already, or you fix information based on the metadata you currently have. They probably should have a printer and a Wi-Fi hotspot as well as a laptop, so they can get to the information that they need to deal with. How about boxes in offsite storage? Well, a couple of different methods of dealing with those. If it's your offsite storage, then it's a simple matter. You can set aside a place for your teams to work that's safe. And if it's somebody else's offsite storage, like Iron Mountain or Access, or some other independent contractor, you can either get the boxes pulled, pallet loads at a time, and sent to a safe location in your infrastructure, or have them create a safe location in theirs, so your teams can work safely and do what they have to do to the information. You need to create a project plan for sure and get it approved through senior management, and talk to the business unit you may be in to make sure everybody's aware that you're going to be there if that's where you're going to do your scope of your project. Let them know you will need to talk to their subject matter experts on occasion and get a list of who that might be approved through the business unit. Now, work to develop your own draft schedule. I know nothing ever goes according to a schedule, but it's always good to have a draft plan. The very important thing at the very end of this page is to acquire a software tool to give you every advantage to getting this project done successfully. Just a quick project note. Whatever project you choose to get your teams moving again, keep the first one simple and absolutely doable, and move on from there. So here is my number 2 pick, finally, for a great project to get your team back in gear. A shared drive project. I don't know how many of you can say that your shared drives are really clean in your organization. I know I've talked to dozens and dozens of clients over a very extended time frame. I've only ever had one tell me that their shared drive was clean. Then they proceeded to tell me that it had actually clogged up again since they cleaned it. That's why I suggest this project as number 2. To do that shared drive cleanup project that we have all put off for so long. How long has your shared drive been around? Well, most places that I go in, it's been decades. Has any of the information ever been moved or duplicated to Microsoft Sharepoint or OneDrive or sometimes Google Docs? All kinds of things may have happened to the information. So maybe we don't have one shared drive. Maybe we have a whole lot of different shared drives. We have found corporate information on C drives as well. These COVID times have had our users working from home, and it begs the question, have all our users in the organization been using the shared drive in the office? Or if not, did anyone put things on a local hard drive and may still have them there? What about electronic processes, databases, and systems? IM professionals like you tell me that they used to know exactly where the information was in their organization. And now as digital transformation moves along, they really don't have any idea because nobody told them what new electronic processes have taken over. But there's no documentation. Do you have any old formats like Lotus 123 and others like WordPerfect that might need to be changed or migrated? How about scanned paper documents without proper metadata? I bet none of you have that problem. Where people just scan things through a multifunctional device without adding in any metadata whatsoever, and we end up with a bunch of pictures on our network. As part of the project, reviewing the back process for the entire network is probably a really good thing to do at the same time as well. I've only dedicated one slide to the shared drive project choice, since it has many similarities to the physical records inventory project. We do want to ask other disciplines for input. We want to keep the first project we tackle as simple and doable as possible. Make sure you have appropriate subject matter experts available, and use a good software tool which was going to guarantee you a good chance at success. Buy-in from senior management is critical, and have clear project goals and scope on the way in. What makes the shared drive project a real winner, though, is that all of your team can take part, whether from home or at the office. And subject matter experts can all be involved with the use of Zoom, Microsoft Teams, or whatever chosen corporate platform is in your organization. We went through the talk to the other disciplines, which were appropriate earlier, but I left out IT, of course. Some of you may have noticed that, since they don't really care about paper information in the organization. Now that we're talking about a shared drive cleanup project, though, and what affects IT, we can revisit that completely. So IT really would like to get rid of information that exists on shared drives, or for that matter, anywhere else in their infrastructure. Duplicate files also are in scope for this project, so try to make sure that any software tool you will use for the project also does dedupe. So you're proposing to get rid of content and deduplicate files. Phew, that sounds to me like something IT can really buy into. Certainly, one of the IT mantras is usually less is more, so a talk with IT should absolutely get you support for the project. But there might be some other IT requirements that you could assist with in doing this project. Your discussion with IT will be interesting. And since IT has budget for things, they may even become a budgetary resource for the proposed project. I really don't want to spend a lot of time on this presentation today talking about shared drive project specifics. The idea was to get our teams back to work in a doable project kind of way and make sure we can get in sync again. There is lots of other information on the internet, of course, you can go to read about shared drive cleanup. It's a very common project. So here's some information about Western IM for those of you that may have to leave the webinar early for any reason. On the Western IM website, you'll find a document for download that speaks to much of what we've gone over today on the physical information project portion anyway. As well, link to this webinar, which we're recording today, as well as the slide deck. The webinar recording and slide deck link will be available tomorrow, and you will receive it by email, links to that. Feel free to socialize it with others as you determine which project you think will work best for your organization, and at the same time, bring your team back into sync. As well, on the Western IM site, you'll also find several information governance webinar recordings that I did for the Saskatchewan chapter of ARMA about risk, IT, legal, privacy, RIM, and security. If you're interested in information governance, those presentations would give you more useful information about the disciplines in question that we talked about earlier today. There's also several recorded Whisper webinars. That's WISPIR. That's the Western IM inventory tool for physical and electronic information. If you care to actually explore tools, as I suggested for projects like this Whisper, would be a good choice to have a look at as one of your options. Those webinars actually talk about the use of the tool for physical inventory, shared drive cleanup, reorganization, migration, more of a project kind of focus. So it would be probably useful as well as you think about what you're going to select for a project to get your team back together. So we've kept the first part of the presentation down to about half an hour, so we had time to answer any questions that came up on chat or talk about things in a more in-depth way. Feel free to send the panel a topic using the chat button as well. Today the panel is composed of myself as well as Ken Oldenburger, the principal of Oldenburger Consulting in Victoria. Ken is also one of the ARMA Canada region team. Some of you may recognize Ken as part of the region team. Troy Sawyer is one of my Western IM partners who is the lead developer in Western IM and also part of the panel. Troy has vast experience in electronic migration, shared drive cleanup, physical records inventory, and all of those kinds of things that we talked about earlier today as well. So now we're going live.
Look at that. And we're all live.
Yep.
Thanks everybody for sitting through that first part of the presentation. I hope you got some useful things out of that. I do want to pick up where we left off on that kind of pre-recorded one, just to talk a little more about a project like that. And I thought for instance, I'd like to talk a little more about the scanning side of that whole thing, because lately, the last couple of weeks, a lot of people have been talking to me about scanning and capture for all of their paper information. A lot of people are suggesting just go scan it all. And I'm really, as I said in the presentation that we recorded, I'm not real big fan of that. I don't know that we should scan everything. There's certainly some things that would be useful with wet signatures and all kinds of useful paper inventory that might be good to scan along the way. But you wouldn't really know that until you went in to do a validation on your inventory, probably. Ken, what do you think?
Oh, so muted, Ken.
Have to unmute yourself. Have to demute yourself, Ken.
No, it still can't hear you. You're unmuted in Zoom.
Yep.
There we go.
There we go.
Sorry, I've been coughing my head off because of the smoke from Washington State.
Right.
So I've been manually muting myself. What was the question again, Rick? Sorry.
Just about the scanning everything, or just kind of picking and choosing what might need to be scanned, Ken, flagging it along the way.
So the rule of thumb that I always do is when you're scanning, what you want to scan is your vital records. So things that you really need to protect. That's the stuff that I tend to lean towards. And that's from a vital records perspective, as opposed to, I'm not talking yet about scanning and destroying. I'm just talking about most organizations, because most organizations don't have the capability to legally dispose of original physical documents. So if you are going to do scanning and you don't have the capability to meet the high standards for legal admissibility, then just scanning the vital records, and things that you need to share. So if you need to get something into the hands of somebody else quickly and efficiently, that's where scanning is also a very useful thing.
I find a lot of people think about scanning in a kind of a generic kind of way, where they don't, they just think, oh, well, how hard could that be? We'll just scan the stuff, right? Not a big deal. But in fact, here in Canada, most of my clients try to use Canadian General Standards Board, CGSB compliant kind of program to do the scanning, so that they have a proper process to actually do that, make sure they have the right metadata, they do quality control, all that kind of stuff. So it's not quite as easy as just, jamming it all through a scanner or anything. It does take some kind of control to get that done properly. So scanning's hard work too. I don't know if any of you have ever done a big scanning project, but it's hard work. It's you got to take everything apart before you scan it, make sure that their staples are out and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's a physical kind of job. You got to do all that stuff on the way through, and then you got to put it all back together again, likely after you finish scanning it. So it's a tougher job for sure than just slamming it through a multifunctional device.
Yeah, definitely. To actually kind of tie that back to some of the projects you talked about in the first half here, is that kind of ties the physical and shared drive kind of parts together, because the scanning is usually going from the physical to an electronic form. So it's actually kind of a good way to think of both sides of the projects that you discussed earlier.
Yeah, so it does tie it together, Troy, for sure.
Quite often.
Sorry, go ahead, Troy.
Quite often you're going from that physical to a shared drive, and then managing that output from scanning is very similar to a shared drive project.
Right. But sometimes, though, as Ken said, you can't really destroy even if you scan it. I mean, I've heard that a lot too, right? People want to scan things so that they can destroy the paper, but that's not really true, is it, Ken? In all cases, you can't just go automatically assume you're going to shred the paper after you scan it. And even if you do quality control and CGSB compliance and all that kind of stuff, some places you just can't do that. For instance, most of the engineering drawings are the corporate record is the signed and sealed paper copy of the drawings, as opposed to, you know, some electronic version of same.
Yeah, that's why when I say to my clients who come to me and say, "Oh, we want to start scanning," um, I I strongly encourage them to start living in the electronic world from the get-go. Um, it's a far more efficient way to just receive your stuff electronically, have it digitally signatured, all that sort of stuff. If you live in the electronic world, then you don't have to fight with scanning. Now, of course, that doesn't resolve our legacy records, which we're looking at
Right.
with the physical project that we're talking about.
Yeah, I flagged down too while I was listening to the presentation. While I was listening to myself do the scanning the captured presentation, that usually on a physical inventory project like the one I talked about, we pick up a lot of other useful information if we can along the way. And one of those things, Ken, you alluded to earlier, which was a vital records program. And kind of my experience for the last 20 years is it's the last thing people do is try to put a vital records program together. And I don't know why it's always the last. It hangs on the end of a lot of other projects sometimes. But at least going through and doing that physical inventory project, you can at least flag those things that look like they're vital records on the way through and put a note in of why they're vital records and what to do with them, kind of thing. Just like we should scan this, put a flag in to say we need to scan this, or things like legal hold, or a change in a security model, or PII contained in this box, or things like that. Like, there's a lot of kind of things you can flag on the way through if you're physically looking inside the box and validating what's there already in a given inventory project.
Right.
That also kind of goes hand in hand with kind of validating your internal classifications, right? So as we're kind of validating physical inventory, as we put that physical inventory, take metadata, we can also put that to things that would be classifications like a vital records classification, so that we do have not just the inventory, but also validating our classification within the organization. If we stumble across something that might not be part of what we've already determined as one of our classifications or retention policies within the organization, that also helps other projects maybe later on, maybe doing an update to that classification structure internally.
Yeah, because I mean the old stuff that's out there, and you know, many provincial we worked, you know, over the years with almost all the provincial governments and territorial governments over time, and a lot of them had a block numeric kind of structure on their classification originally, right, from way back when. Well, the Fed and everybody else for that matter. And then we came along as a group of professionals and said, no, you need a functional classification system, not a block numeric. And so here we've got, you know, 100,000 boxes out in a warehouse somewhere that are in a block numeric environment. And we come along with a new classification system and we go, oh, wait a second. Should we be reclassifying all this stuff that's out there in block numeric format? Should we leave it that way? Should we deal with both simultaneously? Like, what should we do there? You know, I mean, and I've heard different combinations and permutations on that over time as we got involved in those kind of projects. Ken, what do you think?
So that's something that I run into all the time. You know, you've got a classification system from 30 years ago, and it may be good, but it does need to be checked. Things change all the time. For example, here in BC, the payroll records were being kept for as long as somebody was employed, plus another, I think it was 2 years. And that was because of some internal stuff that happened in the BC government. And that has just changed to be 4 years after the record is created, or at the end of the year plus 4 years. I still think 7 years, but that's a pretty dramatic change. So if you are going through your legacy records, you need to be aware that possibly the retention periods are not, they're not lining up all the time. So kind of what I do is with these old records classification systems is give them a once over and flag the classifications in there that are off. So if it's not doing the job anymore, any files that are in that classification need to be reclassified. Otherwise, you could be in legal trouble. Other than that, I say let it live and die in the old classification. And I'm good with that. If it's an appropriate retention period, let it live and die in the old classification.
Yep. That's the importance of having the inventory of what you have, right? So that when changes like that do happen,
Good advice, actually.
Your reorganization might not just be structurally on a shared drive. It might be that you're reorganizing and mapping not just metadata, but classifications as well.
Yeah, I guess it's always the sub projects to the main project, right? I mean, and what I mean by that is a lot of times with us, a client will go, okay, we want to do a shared drive cleanup, and then when we're finished, we want to move it into an EDRMS system or something. There's some other ulterior motive other than just reorganizing it on a shared drive. They want to maybe put it into another piece of software, do another platform or something, and do something else with it. So it's quite all over the map, the kinds of things people want to do with their information that they've actually cleaned up. And in fact, the strange thing is that they'll start out, because the timing's never right for those kind of projects anyway. They go, okay, we haven't chosen our EDRMS system yet, but we think we're going to go with X EDRMS system. And by the time they get everything organized and ready to go and they have a budget to buy EDRMS, it's a totally different platform than they thought they were going to use in the first place. It's like it's a timing issue that happens over an extended period of time. So,
and also along the way, you can identify things that are more important where one solution might be more valuable than another. You might start out thinking that going to software platform A is the way to go, but then realizing that you really do have a strong importance on collaboration, for example, where that tool might not be the right answer. Doing these kinds of projects give you that more information so that the next one is more likely to be successful, like an EDRMS migration.
So I want to spend some time, if we can, on scope. Like, I mean, obviously, I could say I want to clean up every piece of paper information in my organization. Okay, and if I only got one room full of paper, that's not too bad. But when you're talking about hundreds of thousands of boxes of information spread over hundreds of locations all over the place, it's a totally different can of worms to deal with. So what about the scope? I mean, I'm a great believer in starting small, working big. You start small with your team, because we want to get them back to work and focused on a project that will make them cohesive again and get them back in scope. So if you go with a smaller scope and keep it kind of nimble, easier to get that first project done, then at least you can move into larger and larger stuff after the fact. What do you think?
Yeah, there's kind of two things that come to mind when we bring up scope to me, especially around, like, say, we'll take the physical side, for example, is that sometimes not so much how much data you deal with or how many sites you deal with, but the sources as well. So for that, 100 sites and 100,000 boxes or whatever, it might be more advantageous not maybe to start with one location, but maybe start with one kind of source. So often people will have legacy databases, for example. So not so much starting physically how much you're taking on, but the type of information you're taking on as well is also important.
And that applies to a number of the elements that you mentioned in the presentation. Things like a business case. So if you're starting small, you can have a business case that's 2 paragraphs. And at the end of the project, you can have a wrap up, and you can write out like 2 or 3 paragraphs saying, what did we learn? What did we accomplish? What do we need to do better next time? So by keeping it small, you start getting your feet underneath you for future projects of these types.
Yeah, that's a good point, Ken. The other thing I recognize that I didn't say during the pre-recorded section is that usually every team has somebody that's kind of got some project management experience, some formal project management experience. And I know a lot of my friends records and information management space have gone and got themselves a PM kind of education during this COVID time when they were working from home. They've gone and taken some courses on project management. So pretty important to, on any size project anyway, to have a project manager of some kind to make sure that that is boxed and sliced the right way as you go through the project. So I didn't really say that in the pre-recorded session, but I think that's pretty important.
Yeah, definitely. And kind of extending from the project management side of any project, the communication, obviously with the transition of working differently than we have been, communication's obviously been a big part of it. We mentioned a couple of our conversations recently, Rick and Ken, that, there's no more water cooler talk. There's no more, peeking over a cubicle to the person next to you to, get a question answered right away. So that's definitely been an important part to the success of projects since the beginning of this.
I find that difficult too. I'm so used to that whole ability to kind of roll my chair into somebody's office and just kind of sit there and talk for a while, or kind of, just go out, grab a cup of coffee and go to a meeting room or something and just chat about it a little bit. And it's not quite like that anymore, particularly when people are working from home. You just don't want to, phone them at home necessarily and talk to them at home. It's a little different environment to try and do these conversations. I know that Zoom and Teams and whatever help a lot to make that happen. And you can do ad hoc meetings on those platforms as well. But still it's a different environment, I think, altogether.
Some of the greatest successes recently in projects have been around working with people that are more ad hoc. The whole idea of a Tuesday status meeting is not really advantageous to get a lot of work done. The ad hoc calling someone on Skype, responding to emails, when you get them kind of thing, those have been the real motivating factors, or the factors that have increased the success of projects working this way. Yeah, definitely. Kind of supplement those conversations in the hallway that we no longer have.
Troy, are we getting any questions? I'm starting to be concerned that maybe there's some technical thing where the questions are not getting to us, because there's been
there's been a couple of comments and stuff earlier on, but no questions since we changed over to the panel. I did receive one email and a couple of messages earlier, so chat is working.
Yeah. Troy, just before, and if we're not getting questions, then we'll end the session at before the hour's up. But I did have a question, really, and you've done a lot of these projects, electronic ones like shared drive and things like that. Do those get pretty technical? Like, you're still going to need to have IT kind of help out in some of those projects too, right? I mean, the records management team is not going to just be able to go and do all that necessarily. They will need some assistance from IT probably to finish those projects off.
Yeah, well, that was kind of one of the initial slow ramp ups at the beginning of all this, was that getting people like the records users and stuff up and running from whatever work environment they're going to be working in going forward. As soon as we're kind of over that hurdle, ideally you're back to kind of having the same type of access as you did before. Now, putting in new software solutions and stuff, that does take the IT, but that was definitely one of the earlier kind of hurdles for projects. But I think most people are starting to get comfortable working how they're going to be working, and projects, as long as you're keeping up the communication, keeping up the project management, projects have still been moving forward after that kind of little bit of a lull period after this started, so IT could catch up.
I definitely noticed that with shared drive projects, IT needs to be there for two things. One, to gather the information from the existing structure and help establish the new structure, because you're the one that's designing the structure. Don't ever let them design the structure. And then the second most important thing is that they need to help you set up all the security. So I dislike security immensely, but it's a necessary thing. So thanks, Brenda. Good to see you. So they need to be involved in that security establishment, and that's where they'll probably stress to you that you want to keep it as simple as possible and as at a high level as possible. So a flat structure.
Yeah, that also helps end users, right? As soon as you can limit the number of options an end user has to go through to be able to file or access documents, the more successful or more likely there are to adhere to those rules that you're kind of establishing from a records and information management standpoint. Yep.
Right.
Yeah, definitely.
Simple's better, eh, Troy?
Often it is. Yeah, I know behind the scenes we might have 20-page, classification structures and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, to be successful, the people using it need to be successful, and that's where things like more clear filing structures, more use of things like this is an invoice, not finance 01, those kinds of things to help the end users be able to understand what they're doing without understanding the information records management.
Yeah, it's not always easy for the users, is it? Because it's all about them in the end. If they can't deal with it, then the projects usually don't run very smoothly.
So here's a question. We'll answer a question here. So what's shared drives in the future? Do we see that kind of being something? It's an old technology, but nobody seems to be removing it from the organizations.
That's an interesting question.
It is.
Because obviously the best solution from a records management point of view is having some sort of an electronic document and records management system. But how many of us can actually afford that sort of stuff? So I am seeing more and more people going to shared drives and OneDrive. SharePoint and OneDrive, which has more security in them, which is a good thing. But they are not records management ready. That's an interesting question, and it does need to happen because shared drives are not a great platform.
A lot of it too becomes collaboration. One of the things you'd like to see out of projects like this is the ability for everybody to work with this information and records. So collaboration, having a shared drive where everybody can go to their Windows Explorer and hit the G drive or hit the F drive or whatever you might have, that's really easy for users. So this kind of comes back to does the end user, are they understanding where it is and what they're doing? That's more likely to be successful than a fully implemented Documentum system that, you're going to 4 levels deep in a cabinet somewhere to try to put something away. So I see that shared drives are kind of sticking around because of that simple, everybody uses a C drive. Everybody used to using My Documents on their computer. As soon as you kind of put in systems that stray from people's familiarity to access and work on documents and put documents away and share documents, that's where there's learning curves and hurdles. That I think is one of the big things why shared drives are kind of here to stay in some way or another.
I almost see a resurgence in shared drives lately. People are almost starting to use them more. They're going back to shared drives again in a lot of cases because a lot of the newer technology is very complex. I mean, you got to know a lot of stuff to work with a lot of this new technology that's out there now. And quite frankly, a lot of the users aren't they're not 20-year-old people. They're more like 50 and up people. A lot of the people making decisions in the organizations are up there in age group, and they're used to working with shared drives and Outlook email and the stuff that was there before. So I kind of see a resurgence in some of the old tools again because people actually know how to use them and get the job done.
And maybe I'll say one last thing before we move on to the next question. If you have a new technology, like for example, a SharePoint, it's a major project in order to get it set up prior to use. Once it's set up and logical and with a lot of cooperation by the employees, then it works, and then I see adoption. But it's a major project to go from shared drives to something like a SharePoint or whatever, and it needs that participation by the employees in order to be accepted.
Let me just say, SharePoint is not an application, it's a platform.
Yep.
So you better have thought it out properly and controlled it properly before you let it out in the wild, because it'll come back to haunt you,
Yep.
as it has many people.
Just a kind of last little plug. Some of the approaches we've been taking here has been a more passive approach to shared drives and SharePoint, where those people that are responsible for the records classification within an organization have a tool. We do this with Whisper all the time, where they're doing a passive inventory that so users can work in that environment they're used to, and then using tools that that allow you to do records functionality with that content.
Existing tools, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so just the next question we had was about best practices for records that have been created in teams or virtual environments. That
Actually, we've got a
organizations-
PII question from
one more
Svetla.
before.
Oh yeah, sorry. Okay, yeah.
That's a challenging one. That's a very challenging one, and we see this all the time.
Everybody sees the question.
Nobody see. Yeah, we got to read it out.
So speaking of the PII and confidentiality in general, how would you suggest to overcome the access restrictions to RIM personnel, especially in a situation where the RIM is new to the company?
So one of the things that I always do is I try to have some foundational documents, and by that I mean corporate policy, corporate procedures, and as part of that is an accountability document which says what are the roles of the different people. So if you have a records manager or a records officer, one of the roles of that person is to basically look at everything. And so that needs to be built into policy that says your records management personnel must have access to all this stuff. I mean, they can't do their job properly if they don't have access to the information at the highest level and the
That's
lowest
been
level.
a problem for 25 years since I started in ARMA. I can remember sitting around a boardroom table with the C-level people in a very large organization, and the records manager was actually at the table because I brought her, it was a her, with me at that point. And at one point in the meeting, I had to say to the CEO, well, your records manager here has access to everything in the building. And they paled. They literally turned pale because they had no idea that anybody was reading this stuff. And in those days, a lot of it was paper, right? I mean, that was a long time ago, and it was paper. And so, I mean, you can't classify something if you don't know what it says. It's impossible. You have to actually read it to know where to put it. And so the records manager actually had to read all that stuff, or the records staff had to read all that stuff. And the C-level people had no idea that anybody had to look at all their stuff. It was a big deal for them to try and deal with that. So nothing's changed, Ken.
Yep. I think basically if you don't have a policy that defines the fact that you must have access to the information in the organization, you're going to have to start chipping away at the C-level folks, saying, I need this. I can't do my job without it.
No, you're right. That's exactly right. I like that idea of having it right in the job description or policy side or procedure side. You know, I like that idea of having that written down and authorized by somebody at the top, because I think it's really critical.
That's also been a lot. Yeah,
Sorry,
just kind of one more note to that is that I know we've been talking about some of these other projects, but policy review is a great project to do under the circumstances now as well. Just reviewing internal policies, whether it's PII or records or retention policies and things like that. Policy review is a great one, and that might be a kind of project to help get rid of the information they need. Yeah.
Working on one of those right now.
Yep. Okay, so we're at 12 here. We want to answer one more question,
Sure.
And then
Sure.
so people know that we'll
Let's
wrap
do
up
that.
here with one more question.
So the suggested best practices for records that have been created in teams or virtual environments that organizations have been thrown into due to COVID.
Yeah, so there's actually been a number of projects we've been working on where content exists in collaborative environments. I kind of alluded to this earlier. When picking a software solution, you kind of want the best tool for the job, and collaboration is one of those tools that people need right now. Things like SharePoint sites and team sites and things like that. But a lot of the time that content is the Wild West, right? It lives out there, people use it. The main mechanism I've been seeing a lot of and that we're working through with clients is how do we get that collaborative material, maybe not archived, but classified or put away properly in terms of records and information management. So in some cases, use the best tool for the job. And then when you're done doing that collaborative, again, use the best tool for the job. Use your records management software, whether it's archiving or you have a Documentum repository that, content that's when it's done in those kind of collaborative environments are moved to another one that you can manage it more in place or manage it more as an organization.
The corporate repository, Troy.
That's what I'm looking for.
Happens to be. And my understanding is, and I'm not, because I'm not an expert Teams guy, but my understanding is that every time you create a team in Teams, that it does create a SharePoint site on the back end.
Yeah, Teams documents are essentially in a SharePoint site. Yeah.
So if your team is specific to a project, that's great, because then you can just drag it over and you've got a cohesive singular thing. Same thing if it's for a committee, nice and clean. It's when we start having things like a departmental team and they're talking about all kinds of different things at the same time. Trying to pull the threads of that apart is just a nightmare. I've tried to write up a comprehensive policy on how to approach things like sites or teams or that sort of stuff, and it's very, very difficult. And I did a lot of checking across Canada for anybody who's had a policy that works for this, and I have not found one yet. I came pretty close, but it's still missing that vital element.
Just to tie in another question.
It's all about controlling it from the very beginning to the very end, because usually it's not controlled at all in the beginning, and that means you can't control it at the end.
Yeah, there's another question that came up here that we can kind of answer as exactly what Ken is saying here, is that those initial sites, when we put them out, we should have policies in place when we create, say, a team site in SharePoint. There should be a corporate, maybe there's a filing structure, maybe there's metadata, and how do we create those Wild West areas, collaborative spaces, to be more usable when it comes to putting it into a corporate repository, for example, or applying our policies in that. So a couple of things that I see that make those things successful are things like managed metadata fields in SharePoint, actually having metadata fields in they call columns in SharePoint that are relevant to the information, putting it in there. If we don't put that extra pieces of information on things, it's just as like we're putting stuff into a shared drive. We don't know what it is, and then we have to come back to a project where we're having to go to subject matter experts to get answers. So by having things, going back again even further to what I was talking about, the end user needs to be able to understand it. So having a SharePoint site that's put out where the people are making invoice types, for example, and not Finance 01 types, so that they know what those are. You always got to think about what's going to be easiest for the end user, but at the same time, the people that need that information in a records and information standpoint need to be able to do that kind of transition or mapping from invoice to our Finance 01 classification within our organizations.
Well, that really boils down to, doesn't it, Troy, that the records and information management people have to be at the table with the SharePoint people to make sure that things are designed in such a way that it actually translates over to the corporate repository in the end.
It'll save you so much in the future.
I have two clients who are on opposite ends of this exact discussion. In one case, they implemented SharePoint and they used drop downs and metadata to try and organize things. And the IT folks were like, I can find anything. I just do a search. I can find anything. And I challenged him on this and I said, can you find this? And he couldn't find it. And I said, can you find this? And he couldn't find it. And the whole thing was falling to pieces. I am strongly of the opinion that if you're going into SharePoint, use data sets to establish the concept of a file folder within SharePoint so that you maintain the What's kind of, a record does not exist by itself. It's got to be within the file folder to which it is having its relationship, so that when you look at the file folder, you have the complete picture. A single record with some metadata on it doesn't always connect. Now, of course, if the metadata that they're talking about is actually establishing data sets to associate, that's what I was looking for, associate different records into a single file folder, then that's great. Data sets are your friend, and establishing classification systems that connect directly to data sets. That's the only way to go records management wise in SharePoint.
That's similar to the old thing about email, Ken. You know, we always talked about the view of the record, right? You needed the view of the record. You couldn't just have an attachment, or you couldn't just have an email field. You needed to have the CCBCC reline subject, you know, email address and body of the email and the attachments in it. Like, you had to have a complete view of the record, otherwise it was no good to you, right? You had to have all that stuff together.
Yep.
What do you think, everybody? Should we, if there are any other questions, please feel free to drop them for us. We'll be happy to answer them as a group. There's, as you say, as we said earlier, you'll get a link to the presentation, recorded presentation, and the slide deck, and also a bunch of other hopefully useful information as well. So thanks everybody for being on the presentation today. Really enjoyed being with all of you today and giving the presentation, and we'll look forward to talking to you all in another time when we can actually get together at an ARMA conference again in person. Thanks very much.
Great. Thanks, everybody. I'll post a link here in chat as we close up, just so people have the link to the site. There's a banner at the top of the Western IM webpage that'll bring you to the material as well.
Thanks, Troy.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ken.
Thank you. I'm just sending a note to Svetla.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I'll leave the chat open here for a couple of minutes.
Or maybe I'll just answer it. A data set is kind of like a virtual file folder. So the trouble with terminology in SharePoint is that they invent their own terms.
Yeah.
So data set is a pretty common term, and a quick Google and it'll explain to you what a data set in SharePoint means. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.